This week, as I continue to look at the largely underrated and shunned DC Icons line from DC Collectibles, I'm going to turn my attention to the Superman and Supergirl figures that were released as part of this line. It's probably worth noting that these figures were actually released quite far apart. As we can see, Superman was number 10, so quite early on in the lineup, and Supergirl came towards the end at number 25. So starting with Superman and looking at the packaging, of course we see the same packaging we've seen in the rest of the figures in this line. It is staying consistent, which is largely a good thing. However, as you know by now, I'm not a huge fan of this design. Yes, it's very clean, I do like that, but unfortunately it just seems a little bit too bland. There's too much white space and there's just not enough going on here. I feel what this packaging desperately needs is some artwork, something taken directly from the comic books or something newly commissioned for this packaging. The ideal place for this would be on the side panel, which is fairly chunky, and as you can see it just has that number there, which just seems like a waste of real premium space that would have looked so much better with a nice image of the character taken from the comic books. Would have been really impressive, especially if we think about collectors who like to stack these up on their shelves side by side. You'd have a really dynamic, visually interesting range of figures to look at when the figures themselves went on display. The reverse of the packaging is probably the most interesting visually and has the most flair, and in terms of the design it's quite nicely laid out, it's quite colourful, but at the same time there's something very stiff, very corporate, very clinical about this packaging which fails to engage audiences, I feel. Okay, so moving on to the figure himself, of course he is in that 5-inch scale, which definitely rubbed fans up the wrong way when the line was first announced. But in terms of the presentation, the costume they've gone for, the look and style, this is meant to be inspired by the Man of Steel. Now I believe that that's a reference to the John Byrne run, which just so happens to be my favourite run of Superman comics. And I think for the most part they have captured John Byrne's Superman here. We can see obviously the little curl, the little S curl on the forehead there, which is pretty cool. I think they've done a nice job of it all in all, but that said, there's a couple of things that jump out to me. I think the shade of blue for the costume is a little bit too dark. I think it should have been a little bit brighter, a little bit more of a pale blue, and the head sculpt, I'm not 100% feeling it, I've got to be honest. I think it's pretty much there, but there's something not quite right. The body mould is pretty much identical to ones we've seen previously, such as the Batman figure for example, but of course his belt is sculpted on. The Superman S is sculpted in there, the sort of the triangle on his chest is sculpted in, whilst the S itself is painted on, but it's nice and bright and colourful. This looks pretty authentic. And again, we have that bright yellow S on the back of the cape. Love that. I think it's really neatly applied and looks really good. Now, the cape itself is a sort of thin rubber. It's very flexible. It's quite malleable. It won't hold its shape particularly, and it is obviously moulded into a very thin, narrow shape, so you can't drag it around. It's not cloth, but it looks pretty good in the main, and it doesn't restrict articulation. Much like the Batman, the boots have been sculpted around the lower leg, so I think that looks really good. It looks more realistic, more authentic, and I think they've done a pretty good job of this. So in terms of articulation, he does have a ball joint in the head, so he can spin his head right the way around, and he can look up and down a little bit. There's not a huge range of motion here. There's certainly enough for when he's standing, but when you want to put him in a flying pose, it's perhaps not far enough to be able to really lift his head up there, which is a shame. Now he's got ball joints in the shoulders as well, so he can kick his arms up, and he's also got a complementary bicep swivel as well. There's also supporting double jointed elbow, but to be honest, due to the size of the bicep, you can't really get the most out of that second joint, which is a shame. Now there is a pin swivel at the wrist, so he can rotate his wrist 360 degrees, and of course he can hinge it up and down as well. Now he does have that chest joint which allows him to move from side to side. It's very, very stiff, and there's not a huge range of motion here as you might expect or hope for. He can bend forwards with it a little bit as well, but most of that articulation comes from the ab crunch down below. And even then, sadly, it's not a huge range of motion. Yes, he can kind of lean forwards and just about stand up straight. He can't really lean backwards too much at all, which is a shame for a Superman figure who needs to fly. You're going to need to really arc his back, so there's not a huge range of motion here. He has the standard hip articulation, the ball joint there allowing the legs to kick out, to kick forwards, and go back a little bit as well, which is pretty good. Now the double jointed knees here work a lot better than they do in the arm, which is fantastic, and in the ankle there is a pivot there, so he can slide his foot from side to side and of course hinge it forwards and backwards as well. Superman can be a tricky character for toy companies when it comes to accessories because he doesn't really need an awful lot, but he does come with an extra pair of hands and he comes with this robot as well, which I think hangs out with him in the Fortress of Solitude. I could be mistaken, it's been quite a while since I read these comics. Now, this robot also comes with a stand, which is quite nice, so he can sort of have the appearance of hovering off the ground, which is pretty cool. He has a little bit of articulation, so he can rotate his neck from side to side, and his arms can lift up and down as well. There's no ball joint on this figure at all, it's just straight swivels. But the presentation is very nice in this figure. I think they've done a really nice job with the paint apps. There's a sort of metallic paint wash running through him, so he does look like a metal robot, which is nice, and it's a nice golden colour, so he sits very well next to Superman. All in all, this is quite a nice looking figure. It's not perfect. I'm not 100% happy with that head sculpt. Hasn't quite nailed it, and there's definitely some issues with the articulation on this figure because Superman needs a little bit more range of movement if you're going to put him in flying poses. It's kind of core to his character, so you need to be able to lift his head up a bit higher when you put him in a pose like this so he can really look out, but other than that, pretty nicely done. Okay, so moving on to the Supergirl, obviously this figure came a lot later on in the line's run. The branding and the design of the packaging hasn't changed, though it is still quite sparse. The side panel still, in my opinion, a waste of space, and the reverse obviously has the same structure as well. So you already know my thoughts on that. And here she is, straight out of the box. She looks very presentable, very colourful as you would hope, and I think they've done a pretty nice job with the colour palette this time around. The blue is much more of a powder blue, which is excellent. As noted on the box, this figure is based on the Rebirth version of this character. I think, again, that might be one of the frustrations with this line, is that the characters are very inconsistent in their designs across many different time periods, so you never really feel like you have a full set of a consistent run of a universe at a particular time in history. If you're a big fan of, say, the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 70s, whatever it might be, you have a pretty diverse range of characters from different points in DC history, which can be a little bit frustrating for collectors who want a complete set. But nevertheless, this is her look from the DC Universe Rebirth, and I think they've done a pretty nice job of bringing that to life in toy form. One of the key differences from Superman is that this time the S itself is actually moulded into the figure, so this obviously has a lot more definition. It's very nicely painted, very smoothly painted for the most part, and it looks quite visually striking. Also, she comes with a rubber skirt as well, which will aid articulation, as we'll see a bit later on. And of course, she has the same or a similar rubber cape as the Superman. Now, pleasingly, they have given her quite a flexible rubber hairpiece. Again, this is crucial for articulation and being able to do different things with this, so it works very, very nicely. As we can see, the cape, again, very malleable, but snaps right back into position. She also has the thigh-high boots, so this is obviously a new mould, a new approach to this figure, which is cool. So again, the legs do look like they've been moulded to fit inside the boots. It's quite a nice effect, it looks pretty good. As for articulation, she does enjoy the same basic design as the other figures in this line, so she can move her head right the way around, and thankfully, because of that rubber hairpiece there, there's no hindrance to this articulation. You can move her head from side to side with no problems. She can't really look up, but that's the only thing that really gets in the way. But again, as we saw with Superman, this isn't a strength of these figures, unfortunately, and it's particularly problematic for flying characters. She does have the ball joint in the shoulders, and again, you can see the cape kind of drapes over the shoulders, but again, because it's so flexible, it doesn't really hinder this articulation. It does push it down a little bit, but not hugely, which is great. Again, the rubber skirt allows the legs to kick forwards and backs with no hindrance here whatsoever, which is great. This all works very, very nicely. It's very complementary, and I think they've done a pretty decent job. Thankfully, DC Collectibles were a little bit more imaginative when it came to accessories this time around, so they gave her an extra 2 sets of hands, an extra head, and laser eye effects as well, which is pretty cool for that heat vision beam, which is brilliant. And they also gave her this transparent display stand, which is unusual in that it is essentially just a plinth that she can kind of lean against by standing on top of it. It's kind of odd, but it does work surprisingly well. Now, I really like that they gave her the heat beam effect. I think it's a really key power. I think it's a really cool power that both Superman and Supergirl have. I think it's nice to see it represented in the toy, but there's something a little bit macabre and a bit strange about it, I have to say. It's not helped by the fact that the beams are actually relatively quite short, and maybe I've watched too many horror films, but there's something almost gory about this, where it doesn't necessarily look like heat vision at first glance. But like I said, that might just be where I'm coming from, but there's something, there's something a little bit off-putting about this, I've got to say. But all things considered, I do think this figure is a success. I think they've made some significant improvements over the Superman. I do like that the S emblem is engraved into the chest. I do like that they fixed the colour blue of her costume. I think that's much brighter, much more colourful, more true to the character. And I think the head sculpt is good, and I think they've done a nice job with the various rubber components to support the articulation scheme. But again, she does have some drawbacks. She can't really be put in a significant flying pose. It just doesn't look right. And of course, when you put these figures side by side, you can really see the contrast in the colouring and the paint apps. I do think, as I said, the Supergirl comes off a lot better in this regard, but these look quite nice together. They do look like they are related. I think they're quite colourful and fun, which is great, and they make a nice pair. Obviously, the Superman sadly doesn't come with a stand. I've provided my own here, but as you can see, you can get them into some decent flying positions, but they've always got to be kind of upright. You can never really have these characters flying flat, which is a real shame. And there you can see, obviously, Supergirl's plinth there, so again, it gives it that hovering effect, but not necessarily flying. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.